We know there's also a lot of people who have gone back and forth, who have lived in both places or have family in both. So welcome. Welcome, everyone, to the Rabbi Interviews. I am Robert Haas, and I am here with a host of people as we have the pleasure of interviewing Rabbi Stephanie Alexander. We have a host of people from Charleston, especially a lot of her fan club and, of course, her community. We're so privileged to be part of the Reform movement alongside them and only 2 hours away. We're so privileged to be in this country where we have the opportunities to join different synagogues and to have access to this type of technology. So welcome, Rabbi Stephanie Alexander, to our wonderful, wonderful show. Again, welcome to your whole community. We're going to invite people to ask questions in just a little bit. We have a little bit about her. We know she studied at Tulane University. She went, of course, to Hebrew Union College, which is the rabbinical school. And we're going to learn a little bit more about her and her family. And of course, she's married to her husband, Aaron Sherman, who is also a rabbi. And she's from St. Louis. So that's just a little snippet. But first of all, welcome, Rabbi Alexander. We're so pleased to have you here. We really are. And we hope you're safe and sound in Charleston.
Thank you. Honored to be here. And really, I am their fan club, if we're going to be honest about it. But we'll get more into, I suppose, why I'm in Charleston, and these faces on the screen are a big part of that.
Well, actually, now you're, of course, the rabbi of a wonderful historic synagogue that does so many things well, and of course is legendary in not only the Reform movement, but throughout the history of our community. But we're going to go back a little bit before that. Okay. We'll spend a lot of time, obviously, in Charleston, because, again, it's such an important part of your life. But where are you from? Although I mentioned St. Louis, but you're from St. Louis, and then where were you raised, and what kind of early life did you have?
Sure. Well, so technically my passport will say I'm a Texan. I was born in San Antonio on an Air Force base. We're there for a few months, and then St. Louis through high school. And St. Louis is home. I am a Cardinals fan through and through. That is the first thing one always needs to know about me. From St. Louis on to Tulane, and then lots of stops after that. But I'm born and bred in the Reform movement. I am a product of this movement and a Reform congregation in St. Louis, where my family goes back several generations. You know, my parents are here in a Zoom box too, so I will give a shout out. My dad's family was conservative. He grew up in the Philadelphia area, but where I grew up in St. Louis, very active family and Reform congregation. Through religious school with a little bit of hiccup. I was a Hebrew school dropout. I guess that's important to know about me too. In St. Louis, Hebrew school and religious school were separate entities. You could sign up for one without signing up for the other. So I was a religious school student on Sundays for as far back as I can remember. But I hadn't seen anybody in my family, being the oldest of my generation, who had celebrated bar or bat mitzvah. It wasn't on my radar as a goal or an aspiration. And I elected, after a little bit of experience in the Hebrew program, not to do that. But then, as I got closer to the bat mitzvah age myself, saw some friends and the meaning behind the ritual of what they were doing, dug a little bit deeper into my Jewish roots. I claimed that experience for myself and started to get tutored in Hebrew, and was a little bit older when I celebrated bat mitzvah. But from that point on, I was all in, and I was involved in youth group, became youth group president, went off to college, declaring my ambition to become a rabbi. And I will give a shout out to my mother, who scheduled the appointment with the senior rabbi of my congregation at home to talk me out of that. The best explanation I can give is, having been so deeply immersed in that community, it was familiar, it was comfortable. Anything outside of that milieu felt daunting and overwhelming. I wanted to do what I saw others doing. But my rabbi said, go off to school with an open mind. And I did that at Tulane, and took a lot of other courses, but eventually realized that there was just a depth to my commitment to my Judaism that couldn't just be explained by familiarity. I had once again gotten very involved in programming with my peers, this time in Hillel. I became Hillel president. I was a song leader at Temple Sinai, right next to Tulane's campus in New Orleans, where ironically my brother-in-law is now the rabbi. I went off to Israel and was as challenged by that experience as I was inspired. but came back wanting to dive even deeper into Jewish history and in particular, feminism and how that worked into Judaism, because that part of the Israel experience had been very off-putting as a Reform female individual in Israel. Some of the doors that closed there were frustrating. So then I was taking Jewish studies courses. I was working on a Jewish studies honors thesis, all of those things, and recognized that this really wasn't just, again, a function of familiarity. It was a calling. And so I went straight from college into rabbinic school.
So what was the synagogue in St. Louis that you were a member of?
United Hebrew Congregation. Every Reform congregation has a claim to fame historically, right? I know Mikveh Israel and KKVE butt heads over what our individual claim might be. United Hebrew's claim was the first west of the Mississippi, I think. But that's where I grew up.
Really? Because I just was on a Zoom presentation with the new Southern Museum in New Orleans, and I think they had a different answer for the first congregation west of the Mississippi. So that is a really interesting, we'll find that out at a different time. But what was the name of the rabbi you grew up with who you really admired so much?
That was Howard Kaplansky, and there were others along the way too, in the assistant rabbinic or associate rabbinic roles, my cantor as well. But it inspired me, challenged me, were wonderful teachers in the confirmation setting in particular, supported my asking of questions and my passion that I brought into the classroom, and also, and tapped me on the shoulder with synagogue funds saying, why don't you go off to Kutz? We can help you get to Israel. When I was in college, all of those things really nurtured me as a future leader.
How did you go to Israel? Was it junior abroad? The summer
No, it was summer. They used to do what NIFTY in Israel is now for high school kids. There used to be an ongoing college program, and I did the college one, I think between my sophomore and junior years.
Excellent. And you have siblings, it sounds like.
I have a younger sister, who is not a rabbi.
The only person in your husband and your family, it sounds like.
And my husband's family, right? My husband is a rabbi. His father is a rabbi. His brother is a rabbi. His sister is not. Our son threatens every now and then that he wants to go into the family business. We said, but it's just a family business. We're overwhelmed with rabbis. How about a plumber? We could really use a plumber in the family, but so far that hasn't taken hold.
Well, if he does become that, come to my house, because I'm desperate for one of those as well.
Right?
My wife is pretty good at it. I am not. And so you went to Tulane, which of course I'm from Texas. So I know a lot of people went to, were you there pre-Katrina or post-Katrina? Because I know a lot of programs they created afterwards.
You are very kind to assume that I could have been post-Katrina. I was pre-Katrina.
Okay, because I've visited since and created a host of new programs for, I think everyone who goes there now is required to give of their time to help the community.
Yeah, if I remember, we were actually in Iowa, so much further on in our journey together when Katrina happened. I remember watching, obviously, just the devastation that we all absorbed of what was happening down there. But I remember specifically thinking how much angst goes into choosing the college that you're going to spend your more or less 4 years at, and those freshmen in particular who had put all of that decision making into play and then were scattered all over the country at other places that could absorb them. I remember feeling particularly just really touched by what their journey might have been like.
Yeah, I know Tulane did an excellent job of helping out throughout that whole process. So unfortunately that happened, but it was post you. So did you enjoy your time in Tulane? It sounds like you had a good time.
I did enjoy my time at Tulane. It took a little bit for me to get acclimated. I was always a homesick student, going back to probably why I didn't, immersed in the Reform movement, but I was not a camper until I went to Kutz. So that was just hard for me to be away for the summer. And I walked around for the first semester at Tulane with all of the contact information for how to transfer to WashU in my back pocket. That was my out. And it freed me up to say, just try it. You can always do something else. But over the course of that first semester and having much to do with the Hillel down there, I found my people, right? That's the big thing. I was a I was a teetotaler at Tulane University in New Orleans. It was hard to find my people for a bit, but then to learn that I could still enjoy everything that New Orleans had to offer, go dancing at the gold mine down in the French Quarter, enjoy the music without having to do the other part of the scene down there. And then I did love it. I was part of the honors college. I had so many credits coming in thanks to AP and other things like that I could have graduated in 3 years, but instead I was fortunate enough to have an academic scholarship. So I had 4 years coming to me. So I took a class, at least one class, and I think all but one of the departments that Tulane offered. I took advantage of that liberal arts educational opportunity and really branched out from music to creative writing to a phenomenal history class. I remember there were 4 of us in a seminar that met with the professor every week for 2.5 hours for that class in his office in the library. And it was the history of the United States from 1865 to the present, going decade by decade each week. And every week we would have a secondary source that we had to read to cover that decade, and then some kind of primary material that we put our hands on. And when we got into the 60s, the 1960s, I remember we had to go into Tulane's library archives and find out how the 60s touched Tulane's campus. And so we saw these photos of ROTC and protests against ROTC on the steps of the buildings that we would go into. It was just a phenomenal class. It inspired me as much by its structure as by the content that we covered. It was just a really great opportunity. So Tulane was filled with things like that, plus Audubon Park right across the street, just a beautiful setting. Rollerblading back when rollerblading, and now I'm aging myself, right? So I was pre-Katrina and current to rollerblading when I was at college, just taking advantage of the city and the campus and all that was involved there. I loved it.
And I don't know if everybody knows, I'm from Texas, so we have a lot of people go there, but there is a ridiculously high percentage of Jews who go to Tulane. Was it 25%, 30%? It's really
It was
high.
A third when I was there. Yeah.
And this is not an Eastern school. This is a school in the middle. So that's pretty impressive. So I think a lot of people understand how you found such a fulfilling Jewish community there. And the Hillel, of course, is very well known. And of course, the synagogues there are very helpful to the community, I know. So you went to Tulane, had a great experience, went there for 4 years. What did you major in? Was it Jewish studies?
No, I think my major in the end was psychology, because it was broad enough to be able to encompass all of those different things that I wanted to try. At some point, I had an eye toward possibly turning that into a profession, but I wasn't fulfilled by the abstract nature of psychology. I did a little bit of behavioral science too, but as soon as we had to drill down into a mouse's brain, I was out. So it had to be the more abstract component. And I wanted better benchmarks to be able to determine if you're really having an impact on someone's life, and more concrete things that you could offer as they're trying to progress. And that's part of what honestly led me to the rabbinate, the concrete rituals that we have to offer people at times where we're trying to better express joy or make our way through grief. You're still, often touching people's lives at the same moments, excuse me, that they might reach out for therapy. But we have a different skill set to bring to those moments and those experiences. So it was a piece of what led me to this. So eventually my honors were in Jewish studies, but I think my major and my degree was in psychology.
And so you graduated, and then immediately, which is not always the case, I'd say most of the people who go to HUC have been out of undergrad for a few years, although some do come right afterwards, but I think it's a minority. So you immediately got into HUC, which is Hebrew Union College of Medical School, which, if you didn't know, is not so easy to get into right out of school. They really like you to have some background. So you must have been a very good student and had a great interview for them to let you in right away. So you went to HUC. What was that experience like?
Well, so for the homesick child who had a hard time even going away for camp and carried around WashU's information freshman year of college, now I'm overseas, pre-cell phones. That was the first part of the experience for me. It was just the homesickness of being in Israel. Excuse me. And once again, finding my people, getting acclimated to the language, finding an apartment, just, all of those things was overwhelming. But, by the time I worked through all of that, it was fantastic. And my HUC experience was also somewhat unique. I started in Israel, as everyone pre-pandemic, at least at HUC does, first year in Israel. I know it's third year in some other movements and denominations, but first year in Israel. And then I was to go back to Cincinnati. We've got 3 campuses, New York, Cincinnati, and Los Angeles. So you can continue after Jerusalem. So I was in Cincinnati, but that's where I met Aaron. Aaron, who stuck around long enough for our paths to be able to cross. Aaron's older than I am. He was ordained in 2000, and I came back stateside in 1998. So we met there. We fell in love, that whole story. But he was to be ordained, and, not a lot of opportunities in Cincinnati for him to be able to serve as rabbi. So he really limited his search to New York and Los Angeles, so that I could continue. Actually interviewed with one congregation in St. Louis that was willing to help me commute to Cincinnati to be able to make that work. It just wasn't the right fit for us. But so he found a position in New York. I transferred to New York. And if you can imagine, New York City and the cost of living as a student in New York City is astronomical. So many college students, grad students work just a myriad of jobs to be able to pay the bills. Well, I was married. Aaron was a full-time rabbi, and the congregation he served in New Hyde Park on Long Island, just past Queens, had a 4-bedroom parsonage. So we were spoiled as newlyweds and as a grad student in New York, and there was no reason for us to rush through that experience. So I loaded up on classes. You can hear that theme, I guess, back from Tulane. I'm a nerd. I'm an academic nerd. I just love to study and learn and broaden my horizons in any ways I can. So I took 6 classes a semester. I didn't have to tutor. I didn't have to do the other things that most students were doing. We kept 2 cars when we moved to New York. We had a garage. It was mind blowing. And I added an extra year of study. So I got the education degree while I was out there as well. I also had the summer experience before going to New York. In between my second and third years of school, I did an internship out in California. So actually, over the course of my rabbinic seminary time, I experienced the faculties of all 4 campuses of HUC, which is really the unique asset that each campus has. These brilliant minds that the students on the individual campuses get to be exposed to. I got all of them, really, the vast majority of them over my time at the seminary, for which I am eternally grateful.
That's an incredible amount of brilliant people that you got to experience. Absolutely. And so for those people who don't know, also, when she said she did the education part, that means she got a master's degree in education, which is an extra program you can go into. And it's a wonderful, I don't know, not very familiar with it in New York. I was very familiar with it in LA, but I know they're both good programs. So you had a great time in undergrad, even though you're a little nervous going there, a great time in Israel, even though you're a little nervous, met your husband or future husband in Cincinnati, and then had a great time in New York. So you've had a lot of good experiences through all of this. Now you've graduated, or you've been ordained. And before the ordination process, actually, before the ceremony, you're looking for positions. So what did you want to do with your rabbinate?
Yes. So the things have changed since I was in school. And I imagine the process was pretty similar for you, Rabbi Haas, as it was for me, with the double blind match. Is that how you had
Well, I'm only 27. So okay. I just was, but yes, we did have the double blind match.
Okay. So yeah, so when it's kind of like medical school, right? You interview with the congregations that you're interested in going to. They put out their applications. We're looking for a rabbi. You put out your materials. I'm interested in being your rabbi. You get called for the interviews in person. It was at the time you would all go to one campus, the interviewing teams from each congregation and the students who are looking. You would express where you were interested. They would offer you an interview or they wouldn't. And then you would get callbacks after your first interview to then go on site and visit. And basically after those 2 points of contact, an in-person interview on a campus and an in-person interview at the site of the congregation, you have to make your list here are the places I'm willing to go in a ranked order. And then the congregations submit their lists. Here are the students we're willing to take as rabbis in a ranked order. And behind closed doors, hopefully with an algorithm we can all trust, they made a match. That has changed, but that's the way it was done. So you can imagine that's a very difficult process to go through if you and your spouse are both rabbis looking for positions. And as structured as that process is for students coming out of school, or was, there was a lack of structure for rabbis who were out in the field applying. So the first gift that Aaron gave me in my rabbinate, my husband, was to limit his search coming out of school to 2 cities and to find a position that he would do while I continued school. The second gift he gave me was to allow me to go through the placement process with the constraints that I had, find a position, and then for him to follow and find something else there. So huge shout out to my husband, who has empowered me time and time again in our marriage to pursue my rabbinate in meaningful ways. So in response to that, I limited my search to big cities, or at least big enough cities that had multiple congregations that could potentially provide an opportunity for Aaron to be able to continue his rabbinate as well. But I've always been pretty focused. I've never been one to cast a really wide net. Did the same thing for college. I applied to just 2 or 3 schools coming out of high school. I figured, let me figure it out early rather than later, and let me just shoot the moon and see if I can make it happen. So I looked in Illinois, in Chicago, which was about as close as you could get to St. Louis, and my sister was living there at the time. I did look at a congregation in St. Louis, but really, it has to be the right match. And this was something I had not realized when I elected to study to become a rabbi. I think I always assumed or never really thought about the fact that my profession would be geographically limited, that like a professor, you're really at the mercy of where there are openings at any given time. And it just hadn't occurred to me. It actually might have swayed me to do something different early on, because I came from a big family in St. Louis and just kind of always imagined that that's where I would wind back up. There was one opening the year that I was looking, but it has to be the right match. I mean, this, again, it's a calling, and the amount of time that you spend in the congregation and the community. When we say it's a congregational family, it is, and you're so immersed in it. It just wasn't the right fit. I could feel that after the in-person interview in Cincinnati. So I did not pursue that further. It came down to Chicago, Philadelphia, where my grandparents at the time lived, and a congregation in Boston, which was the outlier because I didn't have any family there. But I remember sitting with my grandfather, actually, after I'd had the interview with the congregation in Philadelphia, which was essentially in his backyard. I mean, it was the same suburb in Philadelphia where my grandparents lived, and telling him about this congregation in Boston, and particularly the senior rabbi that I would be working with, and the affinity I had felt for him and what our partnership would look like. And Grandpa Ray, shout out to Grandpa Ray, saying, well, it sounds like you know what you need to do, and you absolutely have my blessing to do it. So I was very fortunate to match with that congregation in Lexington, Massachusetts, Temple Isaiah, working with Howard Jaffe, who has become a dear friend, but also remains somebody that I call a mentor to this day, and check in with routinely when I've got ethical questions, just scope of rabbinate things that are new to me. He's a resource I go to time and time again. So that was the position I went into as assistant rabbi coming out of school.
That sounds like a great match. The year I went through this process, the only difference was the congregations were required to interview everyone who signed up for them. So that may have been before or after you. So that was the only difference in the process.
And I may be misremembering too. That's quite possible.
So it sounds like it went really well. So in Boston, obviously, there are at least 3 Jews in Boston. So it probably was a good
So at least 6 congregations,
yes, right? Exactly. So you go to Boston, and how long were you there at Temple Isaiah? So
we were there for 2 years. It was a great fit with Temple Isaiah, and it was a great fit with Rabbi Jaffe, and I have nothing but great things to say about them. Aaron also had a wonderful fit. He became the interim rabbi of Temple Sinai in Sharon, Massachusetts, and continued that in a second year. And though it's unorthodox, pun intended, for interims to go on to become rabbi of the congregation, they were exploring that possibility. But we had two wonderful, fulfilling jobs, which in Boston, cost of living wise, we needed two wonderful, fulfilling jobs. And they were 45 minutes apart from each other. So we saw each other on Mondays. Basically, that was it. Shabbat dinners, in order to make sure we were each at our congregations without having to worry about traffic and how that could happen. I had most of my Shabbat dinners with Rabbi Jaffe. Aaron had most of his dinners with congregants who hosted him. I mean, you think about that, like, this is where you live. You're not a student rabbi where congregations are routinely hosting, but we couldn't make that work. And we couldn't envision what raising a family in that context would look like. Also, I was a bit overwhelmed. I was not yet prepared, rightly or wrongly, or all on me, I don't know, for how demanding the rabbinate in a large congregation would be. And I also really struggled. So not just the homesickness, but I've always struggled with perfectionism too. Just knowing you can always do more, you can always make it better. And when you are teaching and preaching and doing things, a full schedule every single day, I really struggled with shutting down and finding a way not to be constantly anxious about what was coming next. I would get much better at that in my journey as we moved on there. But for all of those reasons, we decided it was just going to be 2 years, and we were going to look to make a change.
Nice. And that's 2 years is a good amount of time to work under somebody. And as for the anxious part, I was very fortunate. I had a mother who ensured that I was going to be anxious no matter what, wherever I went, all the time. So that really is a little difference there. So, but obviously, it's a very difficult experience when you're working that many hours and not seeing your husband, especially when you've only been together a short amount of time. So you then came to Charleston, or was there another place before? Because I think you came to Charleston similar to the time I came to Savannah. So I know you had to be somewhere else before that.
Yeah. So I described this part of our journey. This was Goldilocks and the Three Bears. Boston was just too big. So we decided to try the small chair and see how that would fit. It was also as close as we could get to St. Louis. I still hadn't given up on that ambition yet. And we went to Cedar Rapids, Iowa, this time following Aaron's part of the journey. So in addition to limiting himself to these big cities and the congregations that were available for me to be able to pursue my rabbinate, he was also really limiting himself to congregations that were not the vision of what he wanted to serve as a rabbi. He grew up in Tulsa, Oklahoma, a nice sized congregation, but he really fell in love with all of his student pulpits over the years that he was in the seminary. That's where his heart lied. He wanted to be in a small congregation. But it needed to be a small congregation in a small city where the salary that he pulled in, honestly, could support our family as we were figuring out how we were going to make our jobs work together. So we went, and he was the solo rabbi of Temple Judah in Cedar Rapids. And I did my first year there. I was I forget what the actual title was. I was the youth and informal education consultant, essentially, for the entire Midwest of the Union for Reform Judaism. So I flew around or drove around, depending upon, it was a wide, big blob of congregations in the Midwest, and consulted with them on creating holistic youth programs and inclusive youth programs that had multiple points of entry and how to move students and youth through those opportunities. And it was great creative work. And I had a wonderful team at the URJ that, we would phone conference. We didn't have this available to us at that time. But two things I was struggling with. One is here we're trying to get our schedules in sync so that we could have a family. We could see what that life would look like. And I was traveling virtually every week someplace else in the region. So that wasn't helping that part of it. And the second thing was, the consulting work was very frustrating. You would establish these relationships with people in congregations. You would plan together, help them envision wonderful programs, and then you would leave right as they launched it because you were just the consultant helping them get to where they wanted to go. So I realized that actually congregational work was something I was missing, and I wanted to get back into that environment. So it so happens that there was a tiny congregation in Dubuque, Iowa, where Aaron had actually served as a student rabbi when he was in the seminary in Cincinnati. While we were dating, he was going to Dubuque. They had decided that they wanted to move on from student rabbis and see if they could hire someone from the field. So it was about, I forget how, an hour, give or take, from home for us. So I went there every third weekend. I drove up to Dubuque and served them for what wound up being 4 years, the 3 years that we were in Iowa, and then a transition year when we were in St. Louis. And it was fantastic. We did love those little congregations. We had our son while we were there, Eli, and just so embraced by both communities in Cedar Rapids and in Dubuque. But just as Boston had come to feel just too big, Cedar Rapids and Iowa in general were beginning to feel just too small. We were routinely invited to Bible studies in our neighborhood, not so much our Bible. We had Eli, but there really weren't any other kids that he was going to be coming through religious school with together. We were older parents. There were some teenage pregnancies, would have been his contemporaries. So we weren't connecting with the parents of the kids that we were raising him with. It just, for lots of reasons, it just wasn't feeling right. But it was the bottom point of the recession when we realized after 4 years there that we weren't going to be able to stay there long term. And we didn't want to sign another, or Aaron wasn't going to sign another contract. So we took a transition year in St. Louis, thanks to my parents for making that possible, and allowed ourselves to spend some time, because initially we thought, well, maybe we'll do a co-rabbinate together, just trying to figure out what the next step would be, hoping that the next step would be, we never say forever home, but a long-term fit for us. And we came to size-wise, something in between. One of the miracles of my marriage, and I do describe it as that, is I was feeling called back to the pulpit, and Aaron was feeling called to be the primary parent at home. My husband, who had declared at his bar mitzvah that he wanted to be a rabbi like his father, and me, who had been struggling with the pressures of congregational life. I mean, both of those things happening simultaneously really do feel miraculous to me. And so after some soul searching, we decided that I would once again lead with the next move. Now, true story, I need to put this out there, honest, true story. When we were trying to imagine where would we like to go next, where could we see ourselves being, Aaron having loved all of his student pulpits in the South, me having loved my time in New Orleans, the charm of the city that's there, and having spent a few days after visiting his brother in Columbia and before a conference in Columbia, South Carolina, and a conference in Atlanta, we had visited Savannah. And so we put out to the universe, Mikveh Israel in Savannah is like the ideal congregation. And when we were in Savannah, the congregation gave us this phenomenal tour, as I know you do with everyone who comes through. And your predecessor was very gracious and met with us in his study. Rabbi Haas, the rabbinic study at Mikveh Israel is one of the most beautiful rooms I've ever been in. Okay, so there's that. So we put out to the universe, Savannah would be amazing. And the universe came back to us with the list of congregations that were looking for rabbis and said, Savannah is taken. But how about Charleston? Have you thought about Charleston? We had never been to Charleston, and it was easy to fall in love there. So that's a long answer, but how we transitioned from Boston eventually to here.
You're always welcome to use the study here anytime, just to make sure you know that. Because I'm very fortunate that the predecessor I had here, when they built this building, they gave him a very large office, large study. So it's kind of nice. So you came to Charleston, and I know obviously we don't see each other very often, but I know that we have a lot of connections through our congregants where both of you were immediately loved and continue to be. So, but before we go, and we'll spend the last half of this talking about life in Charleston, is there anybody on who would like to ask a question about anything that happened beforehand? And you just unmute yourself and go right ahead. And if not, we'll just keep going. I think you're answering all the questions. All right, so now we come to the central part of the focus of this interview. It's this wonderful congregation you have in Charleston, which of course has been there a long time, one of the oldest Jewish congregations, at one point the largest Jewish community in the country, and not just for a short amount of time like with us, but for a very long time. So you arrive in Charleston. What was it like for the interview process?
It was, that was my first, I don't know if it wasn't Zoom. It was Skype. Maybe it was the interview. And I remember I'm doing it through my parents' basement. I quickly, before the Zoom began, I had to look behind me because I'm not Zoom, the Skype. What's behind me? Where I just wasn't used to that, right? And I was like, what bumper stickers do I have up or things that say things about me that I don't want them to know? My son was running, I think, 102 fever and screaming upstairs. And the interview was happening with a committee of people, but I could only see one face on the screen that would occasionally turn this way or occasionally turn that way. I've heard stories about what was happening in that room after the fact, which make me smile. But so that it was difficult. I mean, how do you really get a sense of one another? But by the time that was over, it must have done enough good that when I accepted a call back to come visit on campus, essentially, right? And was met by two of the people who had been a part of that interview in the airport. And it wasn't, just, okay, these are KKBE congregants. It was David and Shula. They were people I had gotten to know. And at every step of the interview process coming to KKBE, it was the people. It was these amazing people that I knew I would get to call my family over time. It was the students that I saw in the religious school and the youth group board that I met with, and got to think that Eli could be as wonderful of a product of this congregation as these young ambassadors are, whether they thought of themselves that way or not. The building is amazing and the city is charming, but that's not why we're here. It's because of the people, and everything else is an amazing perk, but that's really what it is.
And so it sounds like it was a great fit right away. So what year did you start in Charleston?
Came here in 2010.
2010. And so you're there in 2010 and you're in this new congregation for you. What did you see that you enjoyed? What were some of the things you were hoping to do in the future? What are some of the challenges you faced?
Well, I mean, people were first and foremost what I enjoyed. And that was my priority and my focus. So probably the biggest challenge off the bat was coming in after someone who had been here for, I think it was 18 years when Rabbi Holtz retired, and not reflecting on him at all, but just, a congregation that now sees new opportunities and the occasion for change. But my pushing back and being very deliberate that my first priority was to get to know the people, to get to know the lay of the land, to be very intentional about any changes that we would be doing by understanding what the baseline was first, and then making, some incremental changes from there. So that's probably the first challenge. I mean, it wasn't a bad challenge. It was just asking people for their patience, because I knew that would do more for our long-term relationship with one another than anything else that I could do. And that's what I was invested in. And thankfully, I think they were too. So, from the get-go, I think that was just the big thing, just making sure I could get to know as many people as possible, and just filling up my calendar with as many meetings as I could, just to be a part of, and eventually, scale back a little bit. But at the same time, wanting this to be a very long-term relationship, recognizing there are some boundaries that you have to put up from the get-go that you can maybe ease up on over time, but if you don't put them up initially, they won't be there. And over the course of my time in Iowa is when I really found ways to be able to address that perfectionism and anxiety and find some balance that I thought could make this a more viable long-term profession for me. Most importantly, I rediscovered Shabbat. At that first year, I was working for the union and I wasn't working every Shabbat. And then when I went to Dubuque and I was working every third Shabbat, I came to really be very intentional and experimental about what the Shabbats in between could look like for me. I experimented with, no phone. It wasn't so hard back then because I didn't have as much technology on my phone as I do now. I experimented with not running any errands, with not using money for a while, with just all kinds of things where I was setting up parameters, trying to carve out that time. And they didn't all work with me. I don't do all of those things now, but I did find just sort of a fit for Shabbat that eventually, with routine and practice, started to change my mindset, where I could let go of something on a Friday and pick it back up on Saturday night, and for the most part, not be thinking about it for that time in between. And when I got there, it helped with everything else. It helped to be able to take, say at the end of an evening, okay, I'm done. I'll start again tomorrow. I just, those skills, which I had not yet been able to gain any mastery over, became much more comfortable for me. So coming into this congregation, making sure I wasn't doing email or scheduling any meetings or appointments outside of worship services on Shabbat. That was a boundary I was going to put up. Making sure my day off was as protected as possible. Again, I knew I needed to make these things happen so that I could in turn give to the congregation everything that they rightfully would want from me, but I couldn't regress in that ability. So that was, I guess, another challenge, not of KKBE in particular, but just anytime you're starting a profession, figuring out where those boundaries are going to be.
Listening to you now, I think about all the people out there who are starting their rabbinates this year or started it last year, and what a difficult time they must have had not being able to have these meetings in person. I guess you meet people individually on Zoom, but so many of these wonderful things that you did sounded like they came in group settings. They probably had group meetings at homes, at coffee shops, where everybody got to meet you and you kind of figured out the community that way.
And not just getting to know people, but all the decision making that has had to happen this year, to be making those decisions in the absence of relationship. I can't even imagine how difficult that is. And I fear, through no fault of those who are started new positions this year, but I think we're going to see a flurry of people changing jobs in the next couple of years, just because they weren't set up for success. I was immensely grateful that if we had to go through this past experience of this year, which none of us wanted to go through, but to have been able to do it with 10 years under our belts together, I'm very grateful for that shared history.
Yeah, and before we continue about some of the other things in your community that you've seen through the years, does anybody want to ask any questions? Sometimes we get a lot of people want to ask questions, sometimes very few. And I think a lot of people here know you and just kind of learning a little bit more about your details. So if we don't have any questions, you come now, you've experimented, you've met people, you're 2 years into your term in this community where you want to stay long term, at least what you hope. And I know the community wanted that as well. What do you then set your sights on doing? Because once you get to know everybody, I think they want to know, what is your vision for the future of a congregation?
And I've always struggled with that word, with vision. I think it's been one of my biggest challenges as a rabbi is trying to get out of the weeds of where we are.
I said the word.
It's. I think all bad words are not 4 letters. Some of them are longer. That's been one for me. I recognize too that my vision has generally been to build on where we're at. Came into a congregation not wanting to change it, loving the vast majority of what I saw and wanting to build on what we were doing well and see it grow. And then, generally speaking, I think that's a really healthy way to come into a congregation. Again, shout out to my mom, who's on here somewhere, who gave me the best advice in any search I've ever been through, who said, just make sure whatever you do, prepare and, research a congregation and be thoughtful about your answers and all of that. But most importantly, be yourself, so that when you go into a job, that's all you ever have to be is yourself. And I tried to do that personally. I also tried to have very open eyes about the communities I was interviewing with, to make sure I was going someplace where I felt like I could love them as they were, where I wasn't going in looking for a project. And I think, unfortunately, some of our colleagues do that. They think, all right, I can work with this and I can make it into this other thing. And they're just set up for friction from day one. So I loved so much of what I saw at KKPE, but I'm learning right now through I've been in some sessions with the URJ and with the Union for Reform Judaism, the umbrella organization for Reform congregations in North America, and the CCAR, the umbrella organization for Reform rabbis. There was I don't know if you were in one of these sessions, Rabbi, where they talked about being a futurist, which, sounds to me like vision. So I'm already like this, but about trying to pick where you want to be, not based on where you are, but where you would like to be, and then figuring out the steps to get you from here to there. They said so many of us start our future thinking in the present. And the great example that was used was, if I'm going to describe the weather for you tomorrow, I'm most likely going to say it's probably going to be 5 degrees warmer than it is today, right? I've just described the future based on our experience today. But to let go of today and to have dreams about the future, and then think about how you can get there. I'm still working on that. I'm very much working on that. But another thing that was shared with me in those sessions was, we don't necessarily have to predict the future to be futurists. There are lots of people out there who talk about different visions of what synagogues can be, of what community can be, who are informed by things that you and I from our seminary training are not. We can pick from what's out there, share them with our communities, create a shared vision together, and then map that out. Having said all of that, I think early on, the biggest new thing that was brought to me, and was a departure in significant ways, not always, but in significant ways, from where KKBE had been upon my coming, was being very intentional and committed to working in social justice, particularly. And that has been a tremendous gift to me in my rabbinate, that I did not bring with me into the search process, because I never would have described myself as a social justice rabbi, which some might ascribe me as now. I'm not exactly sure what that means, but I like to teach. You heard my academic background. I like to study. I like to learn. I like to teach. I enjoy leading worship. Community activism was not a big part of my portfolio. And in fact, most of my collegial relationships were with other rabbis. They weren't in the interfaith community. But some of those relationships existed when I came here. My predecessor introduced me to one individual in our community, Reverend Joe Darby, as somebody that KKBE had worked with in the past, and he wanted me to be able to continue that relationship. And so I got to know Joe. And then Joe introduced me to new visions of what interfaith work could look like in Charleston, very different than what the previous relationship between KKBE and his then congregation had looked like.
Is New Visions an organization? Just double checking. New Visions is the name of an organization?
No, it's not. Just new ideas for what our collaborative work could look like. That wasn't merely just about bringing community together, which is a great end of its own, but with designs to be able to really impact the community in deeper ways, and impact the lives of those who don't experience Charleston in the same charming, welcoming way that others of us do, making sure that our communities are equitable, making sure that there is justice for all, making sure that when we are described as a phenomenal city to come visit, one of the top in the country, that we are also an equally phenomenal city to live in, regardless of your means and the color of your skin and other things. So in the context of a relationship with him and other clergy that I got to know by virtue of just reaching out one by one, our congregation became a founding member of the Charleston Area Justice Ministry here in Charleston, and built on that work. So I think it's been meaningful for our congregation. I think we're proud of the fact that when you think about the Jewish community and you think about social justice in Charleston, you think about KKBE. I think we're very proud of that commitment, and we try and honor that commitment in lots of different ways. As a rabbi, personally, those relationships that I have with the clergy I've met through this work have been one of the greatest bright spots of my rabbinate here in Charleston that I never anticipated when I was going through that interview process, and are probably second only to the phenomenal people we have in KKBE. Knowing how long it would take me to establish those kinds of relationships, if I could even establish those kinds of relationships in other cities, is probably one of the strongest forces that keep me here in Charleston. It just being able to work together and have this incredible support system of articulate, passionate, inspiring clergy is an amazing blessing that I've found here.
That's a wonderful thing. And obviously there is a significant Jewish population in Charleston, but you're the Reformed synagogue there, so probably the center of any such work. So it's great that it's something that you found you love. I've got a couple questions. One, I'm not familiar with the situation, so I'll start off with that one. And could you tell us a little bit about the days after the tragedy of Mother Emanuel? And
Sure. So the day of the Mother Emanuel tragedy, I was on a bus ride tour through the Deep South with one of those clergy, actually two of those clergy from the Charleston Area Justice Ministry, civil rights tour.
Actually, I think I probably should ask you to some people may not realize what that is. So
Mother Emanuel?
Yeah, exactly.
Sure. Okay. So I'm in the South on this bus trip, experiencing the history of racism and the civil rights movement through the South, when phones start to go off on the bus telling us that there's been a shooting in a church in Charleston, Mother Emanuel, just a few blocks from KKBE, easily walking distance from where we're at. A pastor who I was not involved with directly through CAJA, but had been involved with in other interfaith work in the community, had just been hosted, so this was in June, so in April, just a couple of months beforehand, at Mother Emanuel at his invitation to address the community. And he had spoken at KKBE before. We were getting conflicting reports whether or not he had been shot. We weren't hearing how many deaths there had been, but we knew there was this horrible event that had happened in Charleston. And more details came out throughout that evening. The three of us who are clergy flew back together, and essentially what felt like in the middle of the night, from Montgomery to Charleston. And en route found out that this had been a brutal murder of 9 people involved in Bible study in the basement of the church there. There have been a couple of others who were witnesses to what happened, who were survivors. We found out that the individual was a young white man, and more information came out about him in the days afterwards, and his white supremacist, white nationalist background, and the hate that he brought to this crime, and the precision with which he had pinpointed this church and these victims. And thank God that, much having to do with the work of the Charleston Area Justice Ministry, we had relationships across racial lines and with clergy here in the community to be able to come together based on previously established relationships and not try and create them in that immediate aftermath. I still, when I think back now several years later, I can feel the adrenaline of those days afterwards. I don't know if I've ever operated, maybe the early days of this pandemic got close for some moments, but just that amped up physical response of fear and pain and sadness and hope that you would rise to the occasion and be a meaningful resource for those who had been impacted by this, and hope as a leader that you could bring some leadership to this moment that would guide your community, in my case, KKBE, to process what had happened and to meaningfully reach out to Mother Emanuel, which was so hard because here you had a white individual who came into Bible study and wreaked such devastating havoc. And your first instinct is you want to show up and be a physical presence to help this community through what they're going through. The vast majority of our congregation being white. We would have been white interlopers in that space. So instead, having these relationships again and across racial lines, trying to guide my community to be responsive to what we were hearing from the Black community here in Charleston about what they needed and where support would be most meaningful, and then trying to mold ourselves to be able to do that. So the best example I can give is, a vigil was, well, first there was a vigil on just the day after the shooting. That's what we flew back for, at a church. But then there was a vigil at the TD Arena, which is also within walking distance between us and Mother Emanuel here in downtown Charleston. It was arranged for Friday evening. Friday evening, we were supposed to have a Brotherhood Shabbat service, and so much energy had gone into planning that. But pivoting, recognizing that this is where the community was going to be. And this is where, again, specifically, the Black community had said they were going to be present and were looking to feel the support of the wider community. We had to be there. We had to be there. So calling all those who were invested in the service that we had, our leadership, mobilizing together as a team to share that goal, which was very easy to do. Everyone was on the same page very quickly. And deciding we would shape our Shabbat experience that Friday night to light candles in our sanctuary, light being a symbol of hope in the midst of darkness, as well as our welcoming ritual for Shabbat, to sing a song or two together, and then to walk as one up to the arena. And I would have the opportunity to address the community as part of the program that evening as well. That was the immediate days afterwards. Of course, it continues to this day, different ways that we are responding as a community or not responding to what happened there. We're working right now trying to get hate legislation passed in South Carolina. We are one of now only 3 states. Kudos to Georgia. You were the last to get on board. We are flailing behind you, trying to pass meaningful hate legislation that recognizes that we've got to identify the root cause of this violence and name it, to be able to address it. And we are in coalition as a Jewish community with the Black community, with the LGBT community, with the Hispanic community, and a coalition. This has not been my doing. I'm supportive of it, but others have taken the lead and brought that coalition together early, so that as legislators have tried to eliminate one or another group, most recently the LGBT community from this legislation, we have as one stood together and said, no, it is all of us. It is the same hate that fuels the anti-Asian violence that we're seeing, as the anti-Semitic violence that we know, and the anti-Black violence that's out there. It's the same hate. And this legislation is not about victims. It's about the hate that unifies all these crimes together. So hopefully this work will continue to have movement behind it, but just one of many things that have come out of the massacre that took place here.
Yeah, and I think in states in which we do have that type of legislation, there is still an incredible amount of work to do, as we've seen recently in Georgia, unfortunately.
Right.
Now we've come to the end of the actual interview. It's already 2:00, but I wanted to see if there's anything you wanted to add about what's going on in your community, anything you wanted to promote, or anything that is hopefully going on in the future in terms of people finally being able to come together.
Well, I'm as hopeful as anyone that we're getting closer and closer. The numbers have been falling. They ticked up a little bit in the last couple of days. We are starting to come together outdoors with more regularity now that the weather and the daylight hours are aligning themselves for that. We are hopeful that we will start streaming from our sanctuary, at least as a part of our service rotation, beginning in May. ideally with people present. The numbers have to come down a little bit further to allow for that to happen. But we're making strides. Like your community, like all communities, like Judaism teaches us, fundamentally, safety comes first. So
Amen.
As painful as it is to not be together, we continue to use every tool that's available to us to try and connect ourselves together as a community. And grateful that the congregation, for the most part, has been availing themselves of those tools and those techniques and staying as connected as we can. But very hopeful that I won't say that we'll be back to where we were before, because we've grown in really significant ways, and we've learned about the advantages of tools and technology that maybe we hadn't been so quick to embrace before. So there will be a new normal that embraces the best of what we had and the best of what we found, and brings that together in meaningful ways. And it's going to take time to be able to navigate all of that. So it's not going to, it was quicker for us, for all of us, right? We had to pivot very quickly to go into pandemic mode. It's going to be much slower getting back up to whatever the new thing is at. So we're going to have to be patient with one another. We're going to have to continue like we have done during the pandemic. We're going to have to experiment. We're going to have to be open to trying things, and not everything is going to work. Certainly not the first go around. We got to be committed to trying things again and again to see how we can best utilize them. But from day one, back in that interview process with KKVE, I've known the individuals I've worked with here to be open-minded, to be dedicated to this institution and its bright future, and to be willing to try new things, to see what our next great chapter might be.
And I think it will be great. So we know it's difficult now, but we're so happy that you guys have not only been able to survive, but also thrive during this time. And we so appreciate you spending an hour with us. It's been incredible. Everyone, please join them. Are you doing Friday and Saturday services right now?
Friday.
Just Friday night for your home or from the office?
They rotate. So this Friday will be in the courtyard. We've done pre-recorded services. We've done Zoom services. We've done drive-in services. It has not been one size fits all. And I think that's actually been one of our strengths during this pandemic too, is trying to reach as many people in different ways as we can. So this week is a courtyard service. There is a cap on registration, and I think we are very close to that, if not at the cap. That cap is based on, obviously, on numbers, COVID-informed numbers, but the service will be Zoomed as well. So if you're not able to be physically with us in the courtyard, you can get on the regular.
Would you just put me on that list right now? So I want to get in before while the getting's good.
I don't know.
I'm sure my congregation here will be okay with me.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's probably a busy time for you on a Friday evening.
Well, we're so thrilled again. And again, as a rabbi here in Savannah, kind of a sister city, we hope we can do a lot of things with you. We have a lot of people online from Savannah, including the head of our federation and other executives at our federation who you may or may not know. So
Jamie, can we give a shout out to the littlest person on this Zoom?
Sure, please.
Look at that little bundle.
Where is he?
He's on
Let's see. I'll give the gallery view so everybody can see him. Is he? Oh, there. Oh, yes.
On Jamie.
He is
right next on my screen, right next to the grandparents who are like perfectly looking right there. That's perfect.
One of the newest members of our community. We're all proud to have him in the community. So again, thank you so much, Rabbi. And again, anybody interested, Friday nights, they have services, a lot of educational programming going on there. Please check it out. And this has been the Rabbi Interviews. We look forward to seeing you next week. And again, thank you to Rabbi Stephanie Alexander and the entire crew from Charleston. Everyone stay safe and have a nice week and happy Passover. And we'll see you guys later.